Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management webinar series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen. I'm the Program Manager for the Recycling Market Center and will serve as your moderator today. Today's webinar will provide an update of the R2 certification program standard. Our presenter today is Sean Vries, who I will introduce in a moment. Following his presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box located in the control panel on your screen. You may also use the dialog box to request assistance if you're experiencing technical difficulties during the webinar. And please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites. The presentation slides can also be obtained using the handout feature on your webinar control panel. Sean Vries was appointed by SERI, the Sustainable Electronics Recycling International, to the position of R2 Director in October of 2018. Among his responsibilities, Sean works with the R2 Technical Advisory Committee and leads the R2 standard development process. He also provides guidance for the application and implementation of the standard and educate various stakeholder groups. Sean brings considerable experience in standards development and oversight for the electronics reuse and recycling industry. Prior to joining SERI, Sean was a Director of Recycler Qualification Office, RQO, an organization established to audit and approve reuse and recycling organizations. Prior to use under the industry-led end-of-life electronics recycling programs across Canada, he also led development process for the electronics reuse and refurbishing program and the Recycler Qualification Program. Sean was also active in the development and implementation of the provincial electronic stewardship programs and served as the inaugural chair of the board of directors for the not-for-profit stewardship organizations. Sean holds a college advanced diplomas in environmental engineering technology and environmental science from Georgian College, Barrie, Ontario. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Sean.
Thank you for that introduction, Wayne, and thanks for the opportunity today to be here to speak and to give an update to this audience on the R2 standard, the revision process that's currently underway, and a bit of a status update as to where we're at today. So there's been a number of people involved in this review and revision process, and I'm pleased with the work that we've done, and I'm excited because I think we've come a long way and made some good progress with the standard, which I want to walk you through. Now, I recognize this is a fairly diverse group, so what you'll see here is a fairly high level or general overview of some changes to the standard, and SERI will be holding some more detailed reviews of specific requirements and things like that we'll be releasing more information on soon. So you can look to our website. We also have a LinkedIn page called R2 Certification where we are releasing some of these updates, and so you'll be able to find out further information there. What I would also say here, starting off on this title page, is R2 V3, signifying the third version of the R2 standard. This is a change from the current kind of naming format of R2 2013, which used the date. And this is just something you'll see going forward in this presentation, the standard itself. I think really being more reflective of just the time that we're at, and you know, the group not wanting to have a standard that appears dated, you know, too old, something that is really current and moving forward. So with that, I'm going to move on with the presentation. And I want to start by providing you a bit of a summary here of the impact of what the R2 standard and certification program has had and what it's been able to do globally. So we are a global standard, an international standard. Certifications, as you can see, are around the 850 mark right now of certified facilities. Now, these numbers change on a daily basis, so this isn't exact, but it gives you a good idea of the ratio where different organizations are certified in the key areas. So of course, North America, we have by far the most number currently, with Central and South America expanding. And there's also a lot of growth happening in the Europe region, and of course, Asia, with so much of the electronics manufacturing happening there. Obviously, there's a lot of reuse, refurbishment there. And so there's another opportunity that we see a significant area for growth. And not only with the certification, but SERI's activities in our work is going to expand in this area as well. So you'll see some more of that kind of as we go through this year and as we roll out the standard. So to give you a high-level idea of the revision process itself, I want to start by saying that SERI is an ANSI-accredited standards developer. So the American National Standards Institute has reviewed, certified our process for making the R2 standard. And so we have, SERI has a manual of policies and procedures that defines the development process for the R2 standard as well as the review and update. So this happens according to that approved process. And within that process, we have a 5-year kind of review process, which is standard. As with any standards, you have to reassess them after a period of time, ensure that they're meeting the needs and adequately addressing the market as it changes. And so we go through this planned review at least every 5 years. A big component of that review really is the R2 Technical Advisory Committee, or the TAC. The TAC is a multi-stakeholder group. We have 3 broad groups that are represented on the TAC. So we have the reuse recycler side, which has the organizations that would get certified under the standard. There's what we call the customer group, organizations that would contract with the reuse and recycling organizations. And then there's the other kind of public interest and regulatory group, regulators. We have some auditors, certification bodies, and consultants that work in the field. So all those that have other interests within the standard and the certification process. The idea being we want that TAC to be a multi-stakeholder group across the diverse industry, understanding the full impact and being able to bring that feedback back to this group for review and discussion. So the TAC has been meeting since 2015 and discussing a variety of potential changes to the standard. One of the things that I do want to stress, though, is that when the TAC reviews the standard, this is all based on the current version of the standard. So this isn't a clean slate, start over and work fresh from the start. Really, the process is breaking the TAC up into some individual small groups. Groups will look at each individual element of the standard. We review that within the scope of kind of lessons learned. R2 has been around for 10 years now. We've had lessons learned from on the recycler side, the certification bodies and auditors, SERI itself, the customers. And so we bring all those broad concerns, issues, gaps, any of those thoughts that these groups have that we can address within the revision of the standard. The key is there areas that we can improve the clarity of the standard? Are there areas that we can eliminate some of the ambiguity? And are there areas that we just need to enhance the requirements, raise the bar, ensure that the industry is doing the right thing? So that's kind of the filter, the lens that the TAC looks at this process through. What I'm excited to say today is that R2v3, the draft version, will be released for public review and comment on April 2nd. So we're just a week away from that now. We've got a few final cleanup details to do, some information for posting to get that ready, but that will be out on the 2nd, so you can review the full standard there, and I'll talk a little bit more of that at the end of the presentation. So to give you an idea of the steps to the review and approval process, as I mentioned, this is the ANSI-accredited process that we follow. The technical committee meets and discusses the initial changes to the standard, drafts, changes and revisions. There's also a subset group of the TAC. Again, it's a balanced group, balanced stakeholders. We want to ensure there's no dominance by any particular group. And they're the voting members. So they vote on the standard, the changes, on kind of when it's determined to be complete and to move forward for review. So the consensus body has done that as of last week, which is going to put us forward to this public comment period that I mentioned. That's going to be a 40-day period. We'll post the standard on the SERI website. It'll be available for the public to review. We'll also have a comment form that will be online, and we encourage folks to take a look at that, submit their comments, and not just comments, but suggestions. If there's opportunities for improvement, areas that, changes or something hasn't been clear, any recommendations that you have to move it forward. After public comment, all of those comments are compiled and brought back to the TAC for review and consideration. And the TAC will decide if further changes need to be made to the standard. And at that point in time, if other changes are made, those will then go for further public review and comment. So there could be a number of iterations as we release changes and updates to those changes. At the end of this process, once we have a standard that we feel is complete and has addressed all the comments that were submitted, the consensus body would review and approve that, and then it would go forward for the SERI board review and formal adoption as the revised standard. So I mentioned that the standard and the revisions are based on the current version of the standard. I got here kind of a summary of the general principles because it's important to note that those general principles are also being maintained in the revision. So the key is improving how electronic products are reused and recycled. And we're doing that by establishing best practices for the environmental protection, best practices for protection of the worker and public health and safety, and the best practices for safety of data, and then the destruction of data as well. So there's kind of a three-pronged approach to this. There's requirements within the environmental health, safety, data security controls of the standard. There's also legal requirements that are topped on top of that. And then ultimately, the accountability comes from the third-party verification of conformance. So this is the certification body, the third-party auditors, going out to a facility, reviewing them, and ensuring that they're meeting these requirements that are set forth before them. What we're trying to do, of course, as I mentioned, is protect the environment, the health, safety, and ensure data security. But another big impact here in what we see in the revised standard is an emphasis on reuse of product, of materials, so that we can extend the product life cycles. When you've extended reuse life cycle as far as you can go, then we want to ensure that organizations are following best practices for the environmental recovery of materials and handling of those. So all of our outputs really meet best practices. So to talk about some of the factors that are influencing the change to the standard, I think there's a few key areas that we need to look at. And I would start by saying none of these areas are actually within the standard or requirements of the standard themselves, but they're overall factors that are influencing the change. So first, electronic devices are changing significantly. And we see that now the majority of electronic devices have the ability to either store data or they connect to user accounts on cloud and things like that. So it's a very different stream of products that a reuse or recycle organization would see today than what they might have seen 5 or 10 years ago, where in the past, products like computers were thought of as data containing, everything else wasn't. It's quite the opposite. It's just everything really contains data unless you can confirm that it doesn't. So it has to be treated that way. That's one of the big changes. There's a lot of devices now. I call them, for lack of a better term, these cross-function devices. It looks like a watch, but it operates like a computer. And so devices like that, until you really know what it is, you need to treat it as a secure product, as it possibly contains data, possibly has user information on it. And some of those small devices like a watch could contain quite a lot of information, from somebody's email to the personal health information and things like that. So you see where the devices themselves have a big impact on where the standard can go. Then to follow up on that, and particularly with the amount of data that is being contained now on devices or accessible through them, expectations are changing. And we see this from a regulatory standpoint. There's new data protection regulations. Those often come with penalties. There's other jurisdictions that are looking at passing further legislation in this area. So it's a growing area of concern from a regulatory point of view, and even down to now individual consumers. It's not just large lots of computers that historically would contain data and needed to go through a sanitization process, but even individual consumers with their own individual products have a higher level of awareness of data and concern around it. They're also concerned about breaches or other mishandling of products, and so it's a real reputational risk potentially for organizations that aren't handling these things properly. And lastly, product life cycles are changing. So we're moving away from a use and dispose kind of life cycle, maximizing and trying to maximize reuse to get the most value out of devices. I can remember the days of having old electronics that were so beat up they barely operated anymore, and you kind of used them till the end, and then it could go to that material recovery process. But there's some material streams now, particularly in the mobile area, where there's a higher turnover rate. Even individual consumers know that they can get value out of the product they have if they trade that back and then upgrade to a newer model. So the quicker they get out of that product, the more value there is for them, and they can get into something else they want. So we see these life cycles changing, particularly with online sales as well, and different means that consumers can access products. So there's often a lot higher quality and a lot newer products that's available for reuse in the market than what we traditionally saw. So again, these are the kind of changes that are influencing the reuse and recycling sector and how it operates. And because of that, it impacts the standard itself, and changes need to happen to the standard in order to address these changes in the industry. So to talk a little bit more about that shifting of the industry, if you look in the R2v3 standard, once it's posted, you'll see there's a definition of an R2 facility. And all of these items here on this slide, collector, refurbisher, repair, resell, demanufacture, recover, asset recovery, broker, recycler, these are all functions or operations that can be certified under the R2 standard. So you see that we're moving from what was traditionally kind of an end-of-life process in an end-of-life industry, and we're really focusing on this much broader industry. So as the industry shifts and gets into this more diverse areas, then the standard needs to shift with it as well. You can see on this slide just kind of the graphical depiction of that, in that reuse has always been part of the R2 standard. It's always been there and part of the industry, but there's just an increased emphasis on that now and within the market and within the standard. And so what we're trying to communicate and educate people on is that the R2 requirements apply after the first use of the equipment. It's not just end of life. So it's trying to get products that are no longer used back into that cycle so that we can have that repair and reuse prior to just end-of-life treatment of electronics. So with that, what can you expect from the new version of the R2 standard? What I would say first is that it's based on best practices. The intent here is to ensure that we're raising the bar for the industry. We want a higher level of expectation for sustainable electronics reuse and recycling activities. And so their requirements are both expanded upon in several areas, and there's also an increase in kind of the level or rigor of those requirements. And that's intended, again, to ensure that we're raising the bar for the industry. But R2v3 is not one size fits all. And I will talk about this further, but the idea is it's meant to be flexible. It's meant to allow the industry to operate the way that it operates and still be certified. And by that, I mean, there's such a diversity in the industry now in the operations that the organizations undertake. It doesn't make sense necessarily to force every organization to do the same operations and to certify the same operations. So this is a big change in the standard, allowing this flexibility and specialization and certification. What we see this enabling, though, is some greater growth, development, capacity building in a variety of sectors Take, for instance, the reuse and repair sector. Not all organizations are necessarily going to have the technical expertise, the equipment, the ability to perform that function. But those that are doing it, we want to ensure are doing that to best practices and are meeting those requirements set forth. So an organization that doesn't perform that function, their job would be to evaluate equipment, sort it out and categorize it to determine what is possibly reusable, and then move that equipment to one of their partners that is then certified to handle that equipment. Because we have this modular, flexible approach to the certification, one of the real benefits it's going to provide is transparency into what each individual recycler is doing. We see from a customer point of view, there's a real desire to know and understand not just what happens within the broad R2 umbrella, but if they give equipment to a particular recycler, what are they certified to do? What are the actual activities that they undertake? And so through both the scope of certification as well as what we call the process specialty requirements, the customer would be able to understand exactly the processes that the recycler or the reuse organization undertakes and what they're certified for. So this flexibility comes from really a restructuring of the standard. I mentioned the modular approach. What we have now is a section of the standard which is referred to as core requirements. Core requirements are applicable to all R2 facilities. There's 10 sections under core requirements, and really what it is essentially the current version of the standard, some changes under the reuse section, but it's very much similar to R2 2013 and those base requirements. Then on top of that, what we have are process-specific requirements for organizations that specialize in those areas. So I mentioned test and repair as a good example. I think data sanitization is another good example. Not all organizations would necessarily be equipped to do data sanitization. It's certainly not for all products. So there will be this ability to get certified for these process requirements and under these specific areas. There are 9 process requirements, and in addition to the 10 core requirements within the base of the standard. So if we talk about the core elements of R2v3, I would say there's 4 primary elements that those requirements focus on. Of course, we have environmental health and safety controls, which are currently included under the R2 standard. And a lot of those are very similar. I would say there's not a great deal of changes in those requirements, but there's been some enhancement. Again, clarity, ensuring that we're raising the bar and following best practices. So those requirements you'll see would be very similar going forward. A couple areas where there's increased emphasis, certainly data security and data sanitization, and then test, repair, and reuse quality controls. These are 2 significant areas of increase. This goes directly back to what I was mentioning earlier in terms of some of the influences of the change. More data products, we have to have greater focus on data security. So data security is a core requirement that would apply to all facilities. So regardless of the operations that an organization would undertake, if they're R2 certified, they would have to have data security controls for accepting, handling that product, ensuring that it's treated in a secure manner. And then organizations that are actually doing the sanitization, undertaking that function, would have additional requirements, and that's under the specialty process requirements. Likewise with test and repair, those are also specialty process requirements. What's also important to note here is under the standard, there's kind of 2, I would say, streams of requirement. One really focuses on the process, how an organization undertakes these activities. So how they go about reusing a product or testing the product or something like that. The other stream really focuses on the products themselves. And so it's better defining, if something's reused, what is the quality of that product? What is the functionality of that product? likewise with outputs of material streams. So there's requirements around those as well. So focus more on, both on a process level and also a material level. So in terms of the application of R2v3, what does this mean? Well, what we expect, number one, is improved regulatory compliance. We see this as, of course, the base requirement going in. You have to meet all your legal requirements, but there's ways within the standard that we can enhance that and further drive that. And so you start off with the environmental health and safety management systems and the controls that are in place under those systems. Those are kind of that base requirement. Then organizations need to assess and add on additional for transport, for instance, if they're importing, exporting materials, data security, data sanitization, even things like their closure planning. That touches on those legal requirements, and there's requirements within the standard enhancing that to ensure that that's properly planned for. Data security, as I mentioned, is a key focus, and it's a focus for all facilities. So security being separate from sanitization, both very important, but ensuring that all facilities have the necessary controls to handle product in a secure manner. The next one is reinforcing the hierarchy. As I said, in the current standard and previous version, reuse has always been part of it. The hierarchy has always been part of it, but we're trying to really enhance and emphasize reuse, both in the structure of the standard and how it's now flows through reuse first, just in the structure of the way the standard's set up, and then adding additional requirements and clarity around evaluating products that are suitable for reuse and ensuring that they get to those appropriate streams. And then the last big impact that I think here in terms of the application of the standard is what I've talked about is flexibility and how organizations themselves can be certified under the standard with core requirements in any of those specialty areas. But we also look at this from a material stream point of view. There's a material stream that's now termed verified specialty equipment. And what we found is that's happening in the marketplace is there's some very high-end equipment that might be taken out of cellular installations, for instance, medical equipment. There's organizations that work with the suppliers of that equipment. They remove it from a working environment. There may not really be appropriate test procedures or test jigs and things like that for this equipment, and it would need to go into an actual working environment for tests. And so we're trying to incorporate things like that into the standard, recognizing this is the way that the industry operates, and putting controls in place just to ensure that it's being done in a responsible manner. Likewise, there's also recognition for customer-owned equipment. Now we know that this happens in the marketplace currently. A customer, it could be a carrier, a retailer, or something like that has a large amount of equipment. They may send to one organization that they want to simply evaluate and sort that equipment. And then based on the condition, they have different downstream needs. And so we've worked this ability to recognize and for customers to kind of direct some of that material into the standard, recognizing that that's already happening in the marketplace currently. So the difference that this is going to make and that these changes will make, I would say first and foremost, R2v3 is going to be a comprehensive risk management tool, better representing the industry, as I've talked about, the broad industry and how diverse it is. Also, the devices that are coming back with all of the data containing devices and just such different material than what we've typically seen. Strengthening the requirements, that's both in terms of the coverage of those requirements, adding in additional areas like the test and repair, additional information for sanitization, and then ensuring that each of those is at the right level. The other difference here with this standard is it's really intended to be outcome-based. So what we're trying to drive to is not a set of procedures and a set of processes that maybe are or aren't implemented, but what we want to see is the outcomes of those processes and procedures, that organizations are actually handling things in the proper manner. So it's not just about implementing at a procedural level, but it's operating and demonstrating the results. So emphasis being on the results from what the activities are. We'll differentiate both the specialty services. We'll be able to differentiate the expertise within the industry. I think that's an important factor from the industry point of view, and certainly also what we've seen from a customer point of view, just wanting to know clearly what each organization does and what they're certified to do and what they've been audited to do. There's also going to be some more structure in the R2V3, and there's a couple of areas of this. And so how it's applied, there's a companion document called the R2 Equipment Categorization. And this is meant to provide more structure around the evaluation process for equipment, when that goes through the reuse system, how that material is then classified based on its condition, its functionality. So this document will eliminate the need for the current reuse, ready for reuse, ready for repair, those definitions that are used in the standard. It's also going to help a recycler or reuse organization identify when they have equipment in their facility or in their control, what is applicable under the standard? How does that material flow through the standard? And so better aligning those requirements with each stage in the process and how that material is being handled. So overall, the intent here and one of the key focuses of the TAC has been consistency, ensuring that what we're putting together is clear enough, is straightforward enough for consistent application, and then both on the recycler part, but also on the audit side. So you have consistency in the implementation of those items. The more of that, the better quality we have and the more confidence in the results. So I see that as one of the primary benefits of the standard, the improved quality of the certification and the credibility of the results. We want to ensure that there's clarity and understanding of all the requirements, removing that ambiguity, consistency in how things are interpreted across the board, again, both by recyclers and auditors, so that there's equal application of those. And then really that's going to result in greater accountability of all organizations that are involved in the certification process. The other benefit here is really to address that diverse industry. So where there's challenges in place right now currently in organizations that are doing things like customer managed equipment, that the example that I mentioned, we're trying to work those types of things into the standard to ensure that it is working across the board for the industry. We want that base consistent level of requirements for all organizations, but then specific areas where there's specialized operations happen, they have their own unique needs and their own unique requirements. Transparency comes out of that. That will be a big result for all, including the customers, the recyclers themselves, just everybody to understand what's really happening in the R2 certification process. And then there are other efficiencies that we talk about as well. One of the examples I would give is not requiring R2 certified organizations to track past the next R2. So we see an opportunity for efficiencies here where the organization currently would be tracking material all the way downstream. If they so choose to, they can continue to do that. If they work with R2 organizations, particularly smaller organizations, there's always been a hurdle for them if they have low volumes to try to track material all the way downstream. And so we see a real benefit if it's included and maintained within the R2 stream to give them some efficiencies there. And as I mentioned, the ability to specialize, that works on both sides. That works for organizations that want to add on those extra requirements and those extra abilities, but also for some of those organizations that are perhaps smaller, that don't want to add on specialty process requirements. It doesn't prevent a barrier for them to enter. It still allows them to certify to the core requirements of R2 and to conduct their business as they're doing. So as I mentioned, we are going to public comment for the standard on April the 2nd, and that's going to be a 45-day comment period. So there's a bit of a time here that we're not really sure how long it's going to take, and that's that TAC review and revision process, depending how many comments we get back, depending how many iterations we might need to go through. But what we're thinking is kind of between now and the summer, the TAC will be working on proposed changes to the standard, making additional updates, and perhaps going out for additional public comment on those changes. We hope that the review will be complete, the standard will be approved by the consensus body, and have something that we can put forward to the SERI board for adoption around the summer time this year. And that would allow us to do a formal public release kind of near the end of the summer, fall period. And what we expect is probably a 2-year implementation for all facilities to upgrade and to certify to the revised standard. So this is a draft rollout. It's subject to change, but it just gives a broad idea of timelines and what we're planning for at this point. So I mentioned the public review and comment period. This is a very important part of the process. As much as we've maintained this multi-stakeholder group with the TAC and a balanced representation to our consensus body, we really do emphasize that for the public to review the standard and to submit additional comments. We recognize that there are always kind of unique scenarios out in the marketplace that individual businesses may be encountering that we may not have thought of or addressed. So we're really encouraging the public comment period. Like I said, it's a 45-day period, not just for comments, but I really want to suggest as well the suggestions. It's if there's opportunities to improve, if there's ways we can make changes, feel free to review and submit those. And all those comments do get considered by the TAC and will be potential opportunity for changes that then go out for review again. So that gives you an idea of the high-level changes. We will be posting the draft standard, as I mentioned, on the SERI website. We will have a comment form on there as well, and really encouraging folks to submit that information and their comments as soon as they can. I want to thank everybody for their time today and taking the opportunity to participate in this. As I mentioned, this is just a high level. We will be rolling out further, more detailed communications on specific requirements and things like that, but certainly trying to get people engaged early and give them an idea of some of the changes so it isn't too shocking for them when they see the new standard. So again, thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to you, Wayne.
Okay, Sean, thank you very much. So now we're going to field some questions for Sean. If you do have a question or comment, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box. We don't have anything at this time, but hopefully people will start typing in some questions here. I have a quick question. What's the biggest challenge for an organization to meet the R2 requirements to get certified for R2?
It really is, and I think diversity of the industry is one of the messages that we're trying to communicate now. So it really is dependent on where they're starting out from. Many organizations that have established procedures in places and management systems would find that this fits along really well with those existing procedures and management systems that they have. So for those, they may be further along. If it's more of a startup organization that doesn't have that type of thing in place, I think that's sometimes the biggest challenge, is just trying to get through that management system frame of mind and reading the standard, documenting their controls and their management systems, and then demonstrating those things. So there's some opportunity there for organizations that have experience in that might be a little further along.
Okay, still no questions. Is there anything you want to add, Sean, to the presentation? Any other comments or news out there?
Yeah, I would just say, to emphasize again, because I think when people see the standard, they're going to think it looks very different. It's a fairly long, it's a meaty document. Part of that is, by breaking things out into those process requirements. So take a look at it in detail into what requirements would apply to your organization or the organizations that you're working with, because not everything is applicable to every organization. So I want to emphasize that. And those core requirements really are similar to the current core requirements. So we've done some mapping of the 2013 standard to R2v3, and we're going to provide that information online. So that's there for organizations that are making the transition, and they can see what they've done now and where that is in the standard and where that'll be addressed in the new standard, because there's so much similarity. It's just going to be a new frame of mind that people need to look at it through just to understand how it flows.
Okay, here's a question. Does the R2 standard cover the recycling of batteries and equipment?
Yes, it does, in the sense, so batteries are referred to as a focus material. They'll continue to be a focus material, and so there are requirements on how those have to be handled. What I would also say is there's greater emphasis now, because of some of the risks associated with batteries, on even from how material is accepted and handled. And so requiring in the core requirements organizations to do assessments of their material. We often see issues with what are called expanding batteries. Those are the ones that have a tendency to cause fires. And so controls in place to identify things like that to prevent, risks in the operation. So batteries are certainly part of the standard and included both in the risk assessment process, but also as a focus material and special handling there.
Okay. What are the consequences for non-compliance, and who enforces this?
So as I mentioned, it's a third-party verification. So when a reuse recycle organization wants to be certified, they go out and select one of the SERI-approved certification bodies, and that third party conducts their audit. They're responsible for determining the compliance or conformance with the standard, and they would write up an organization for any issues of non-conformance. So where issues are identified, it's the certification body's responsibility to identify those issues, to look for corrective actions on those. I mean, ultimately, non-conformance would result in, well, for continued, could result in suspension of approval, their kind of removal of certification as well. So it just depends on where it's at in the stage. SERI's job really is to manage the standard and the overall certification process. So we don't get into issuing non-conformances per se, but we can conduct spot audits. We do audits of quality control audits of the audit packages. And so there are other controls that we implement just to ensure that the process itself is working.
Does R2 require a closure plan that could include bonds or funds to ensure proper cleanup of sites?
Yes, it does. So there's a bit of a change in the requirement in that pollution liability insurance is no longer required under the core requirements. That is part of the material recovery process requirement. And the reason for that is if we have small organizations that might be reuse focused, not dismantling materials, the pollution liability didn't necessarily make sense in those organizations. They would still require the closure plan, however. All organizations require that. Now, for some low risk, small facilities, there is an exemption if they meet certain requirements that they wouldn't need the bond. But generally, most organizations would require a plan and a bond for proper closure of that facility.
And to add to that, I know a lot of state permitting programs do require bonding and closure plans that require some funds that are set aside to ensure a closure is done properly.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. This question asks if you're certified to a specific operation or process, and then later you add another process, does that require a whole new specific certification?
You wouldn't need to redo the entire certification. Now, I want to be careful and clear how I say this, because there's a certification process and there's a regular surveillance of that as well. And so you may add on a new process. It may be part of your recertification. It may be something that is added on in between. And so it would need to be audited and certified, that particular process requirement, before it's added. But it depends on when the organization chooses to do that. It may be as part of a surveillance. It possibly could be on its own, I suppose, if an organization chose to do that, or they could just include it with a regular recertification.
Okay, I hope I state this question correctly. With not required to track past the next R2, is that also going to apply with Rios recyclers?
I can't comment on the Rio side if there's other changes or other implications there. What I would say is that the intent in the corresponding requirement to not requiring to track past the R2 is that recyclers are required to register their downstream flow with SERI. So what we want to be able to understand and have for kind of tracking purposes is the overall flow of material. And so if one recycler to an R2, they don't need to follow further, but SERI will still understand that entire flow. It will still be certified through the downstream diligence process. So we're really just saying for that particular recycler, they don't need to follow it further, but all the other diligence requirements would still apply. And the trade-off being that each of those flows is registered with SERI, so we can see that overall process flow.
Okay, are there any modifications to provision 5? If so, what's the most notable modification?
There are some, and if I just want to pull out some notes here. When we're talking about, and actually I got to make sure, provision 5 in the current, or we're talking focus materials. I just want to make sure that's clear, right? Did they indicate?
They did not.
Okay.
I might get a follow-up here to clarify that. So assume, okay. Yes, it is focus materials. Yep.
Okay, great. So under the revised standard, our focus material management plan is still required. An organization will still need to define what they're doing, but some of those requirements that are in the current standard are actually broken out and pushed out to the process-specific requirements. So you'll have, for instance, the downstream flow of materials, so selection of downstream vendors. That would be one of those requirements that's specialty process. And the reason for that is, if you're an organization, R2 certified, that's at the end of the chain, you wouldn't really have a downstream recycling chain. So you think of a smelter handling leaded glass, or an organization that's processing batteries, something like that. So that's why that's been moved from focus materials to the process appendices. And likewise, the material recovery portion has also been pushed out to an appendice, because not all recyclers or organizations are necessarily doing that material recovery aspect. So those two, the requirements are similar, but it's moving it out to better reflect the organizations and how they actually handle that material.
Okay, I think that's the end of the questions. So we're going to close up here. So again, the webinar, like all webinars in this series, has been recorded and will be made available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and Recycling Market Center websites. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you'll join us for next month's webinar. Please visit the NRC and RMC websites for schedule updates. And thank you, Sean, for providing your time and providing this great information.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great day.